general rule, people usually have a basic understanding of their personality. In this study, we will be examining what happens to people's self-esteem when they receive the results of the Big Five personality assessment. The Big Five personality traits. Extroversion versus introversion. Extroversion is characterized by friendliness, talkativeness, assertiveness, and excitability. People high in extroversion tend to seek social stimulation and are often described as being full of life, energy, and positivity. Introverts tend to be quiet, reserved, and less involved in social situations. Agreeableness is characterized as trustworthy, modest, empathetic, and cooperative. Although agreeableness has many positive aspects, there are some disadvantages. People who score low in agreeableness tend to be more hostile and antagonistic. They also tend to have more difficult relationships that are riddled with disagreements and breakups. Conscientiousness is characterized as responsible, reliable, organized, and hardworking. Someone who is conscientious will rarely make impulsive or careless decisions. On the other hand, people who are low in conscientiousness are often described as casual, laid back, and relaxed. They are less likely to follow schedules and are not prone to extensive planning. High and low openness. People high in the trait of openness tend to approach unfamiliar things with a level of curiosity. They are also good at thinking about and making connections between different concepts and ideas. People low in openness tend to prefer routine and tradition. Individuals with extremely low openness may be seen as rigid and closed-minded, and they may find it difficult to cope with change. Neuroticism is a core personality trait characterized by anxiety, self-doubt, depression, and other negative feelings. Like other personality traits, neuroticism exists on a continuum, which means people can be high, low, or somewhere in the middle in terms of this trait. Neuroticism can affect relationships in various ways, as they live with emotional instability and may have trouble regulating their behaviors as a result.
For the method section, we used a G-power analysis and predicted that 128 Idaho State students would be recruited as participants, with most expected to be between the ages of 18 and 25, with a mean age of 20. The sample is expected to be about 60% female and 80% Caucasian, with few other ethnicities included. The survey was hosted on Qualtrics with the incentive of course credit offered and/or new insights into their personality, self-esteem, and self-concept as a whole. When the study was conducted, we had a total of 53 participants start the survey, with 47 completing it. For the first measure, the Big Five Inventory 2 short form will be used to assess personality and contains 30 items rated on a 5-point Likert scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The test is also scored on 5 domain scales with 6 questions for each of these traits. The total scores for each trait will be the average of the responses for the set of trait-specific questions, with averages ranging from 1 to 5. Higher scores will indicate higher levels of that trait and will be broken down into groups of low, moderate, and high trait levels. For the second measure, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale will be used to assess self-esteem and contains 10 items on a 4-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Scores for this scale range from 10 to 50, with the higher score indicating higher levels of self-esteem. The scores for this scale will be broken down into groups of low, moderate, and high. For measure 3, the self-concept clarity scale will be used to assess self-concept and contains 12 items rated on a 5-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Scores on this scale range from 10 to 60 and will be broken down into low, moderate, and high self-concept categories. For measure 4, there will be a demographic questionnaire gathering information regarding students' age, sex, and ethnicities. For the procedure, as mentioned before, the online survey will be hosted through Qualtrics, with students receiving a QR code or URL. Participants will then read a consent form and brief explanation of the study, and the surveys will be anonymous. Participants then fill out a BFI2 scale, with the experimental group receiving a document with information about their personality assessment results. The control group will not receive this document. Both groups then fill out the Rosenberg self-esteem scale and a self-concept scale, and in order to counterbalance the experiment, half the groups will receive the Rosenberg scale first, with the other half receiving the self-concept scale first, and vice versa. A debriefing statement will then be on the last page of the survey for participants to view.
For the results section, an independent samples t-test was used to analyze the data. It was appropriate because t-tests are used to determine if two groups are significantly different from each other, and we were seeking to determine whether the mean of the control group, which provided no information about personality, differed from the mean of the experimental group, which provided information about personality. The independent variable was the amount of information provided about personality, and the dependent variables were self-esteem and self-concept clarity. The experimental condition did not significantly affect the dependent variables. The control condition and the experimental condition group scored similarly for self-esteem with an n-value of 45, t-score of 0.241, p-value of 0.81, and Cohen's d of 0.07. And that's for self-esteem, as well as for self-concept clarity with a t-score of negative 0.955, p-value of 0.341, and a Cohen's d of negative 0.279. Pertaining to the self-concept clarity measure, there was a mean difference between the control condition, which had an m value of 2.913 and a standard deviation of 0.984, and the experimental condition, which was m equals 3.158 and a standard deviation of 0.769, which indicates a small effect size of d equals 0.279, and this is all shown in Table 1. There was no significant mean difference in self-esteem between the control condition and the experimental condition.
For the discussion, we determined that within our results between the control and the experimental group that showed no difference. As shown in Table 1, our mean and standard deviation for both pertaining to self-concept, clarity, and self-esteem showed very similar patterns to pertain to one another. The control group and experimental group scored very similar within the self-esteem measure, and they also scored similar within the self-concept clarity measure as well. With the research that we conducted, we concluded that our test did not correlate to other tests ran by the outside studies we researched. With this, they found that there was significant correlation between personality traits and self-esteem, whereas we found no correlation between the personality traits and self-esteem. One implication that comes from our test not having a positive significant correlation between personality traits and self-esteem is that in some cases personality traits do not always directly affect someone's self-esteem. We concluded that the biggest limitation of our study was the lack of effort put in by the sample groups within our surveys. This is evidenced by not all the surveys that were completed, and some were directly contradicting themselves. Another limitation of our study is that we could not determine whether people took their time on the survey and answered honestly. One of the suggestions for future research that we have would be to incorporate a larger sample size to represent the population more accurately. Another suggestion that we have to better the future research would be that we initiate a proctoring system for the survey to ensure that the proper amount of time and effort is implemented. Overall, while conducting our research prior to our study, we found that many of the previous studies were able to prove a significant correlation between the personality traits and self-esteem. Throughout our study, we found that there is not always a significant correlation between personality traits and self-esteem.